Good afternoon, everyone. So this is going to be our week 9, lecture 9. And first of all, as usual, we will be starting with a short summary. And right after the summary, I am going to start with the new part of our lecture. And we will continue from Joseph Nye on about his book Cooperation and Conflict, or Conflict or Cooperation, obviously. So without further ado, Joseph Nye, Understanding Conflict and Cooperation. This is what we studied last week, and last week we talked about the conceptual toolkits, the concepts, and specialized vocabulary. These, according to Joseph Nye, in order to be able to understand theory as well as history in relation to international relations and political world, we have to have a toolkit, and within our toolkit we have concepts, words, and we have special vocabulary, and these vocabulary must be well defined. It has to be very clear in order to have a scholarly validity, and so that we amongst scholars and academicians, we can understand each other. So in order to understand theory and history, we have to have a toolkit. And we talked about some concepts. We talked about states, nations, and nation states. So along these lines, we said that the most used concept in the study of world politics is the combination of two words, sovereign and state. But is also the most confusing combination because two concepts are bundled together. So we have to, first of all, pull these two words from each other and take a look at them individually. So we also made a distinguishment between realists for whom states are the only significant actors, and there isn't any other actor beyond the state for realists, while liberals on the other side argue that states are one of the many. But what exactly is a state? Atija, I see that you've joined. I thought that you might not join today, so I already started, but I can start obviously again. Good evening. Can you hear me? So I'm going to start again, if you don't mind. Okay. Last time, we are obviously talking about the module Comparative Politics, Conflict, Identity, and Ideology. And last week, I talked about, I continued with Joseph Nye. And Joseph Nye, in his book Understanding Conflict and Cooperation, he especially he emphasized the importance, the significance of having a conceptual toolkit. And in this toolkit, he advises us, in this toolkit there are words, specialized vocabulary, terms, concepts, and words. And we political scientists, international relations specialists, we should have definitions, well-defined concepts in order to be able to understand each other, but also understand the history, the discourse of history, and obviously in relation to international relations and political world. So yes, this is going to be the part of last week. So I'm going to make a bit of a summary of last week. And no problem. Don't apologize. No need for apology, because this is my job. So I'm doing this anyway. But when you're here, it's better. It's like talking to you. So it's fine. It's perfect. Thank you for joining us. And first of all, I'm going to do a summary of last week. And as I just said. Just before you joined, I was talking about the author of the book, Joseph Nye. And Joseph Nye, we started with Joseph Nye and Understanding Conflict and Cooperation. So Joseph Nye actually wants to emphasize in his literature, in his book, and I will make sure that you get the parts of that book so you can read those parts for your course as material. He says, well, we political scientists, we specialists of international relations, we must have a toolkit. And this toolkit, we have tools in that toolkit, and these are words, concepts, terms, and vocabulary. And these words and concepts and vocabulary must be well defined. So there must be a good definition, written definition, which is clear and which will increase the validity of the way we use these concepts. Otherwise, we might not understand each other. So this is extremely important, he says. And then he talks about a couple of these concepts. For example, state. What is a state? He says, what is a nation? What is a state? And when you bring these words together, nation state, what does it mean? So these concepts are very important for us political scientists when you write about them, when you talk about them, when you give a conference, when you give a lecture, or when you do research, obviously. So moving on to the next slide. Another interesting combination is the sovereign state. So the problem, he says, Joseph Nye says, well, we use these words sovereignty, sovereign state, nation, a lot in political sciences, but these are also very confusing because these concepts are bundled together, they're combined, and in order to understand them, we have to pull them apart and look at them individually and try to understand them. And last week I also made, because of Joseph Nye, I made a distinction between realists and liberals. And for realists, for example, looking at the state is very significant, because for realists, for the realism school of thought, state is the only most important actor. So when you do an analysis from the realist approach, you would only actually look at the state level. So you would compare states, or you would look at the characteristics of the state, and the state is the most important. For liberals, liberals would argue that states are important, but they're not the only one. So for liberals, it would be NGOs, institutions, but also international organizations, etc. So state is not the only significant one, but it's an important one. But there are others as important as the state, liberals would say. So we made those distinctions. And so in order to be able to talk about a state as a political unit, it must have two crucial characteristics. One, territoriality. Two, sovereignty. So territoriality is equal to a state governing over a specific identifiable portion of the Earth's surface. So it's a piece of land, right? So it's a land mass, and it has boundaries. So that's territoriality. And a state can only exist if it has territoriality. And the second one would be sovereignty, and the sovereignty is equal to the absolute right to govern over this territory, over this landmass. In the old days, we talked about this. You should remember, we talked about in the old days, it was the monarch, it was the king, the queen, who was sovereign, meaning having absolute right to govern this piece of land. And in democracies in the modern age, it is the people who hold the true sovereignty. But the people, because of democracy or elections, the people delegate this sovereignty to the elected governors, to the people who are elected representatives and other state officials to organize sovereignty within a state, right? So this is very important to understand what we're going to talk about. And, Nye also says, please don't confuse a state with a country. State is not equal to a country. A country is a country. So you can talk about different countries, United States, Germany, the Netherlands, Turkey, etc. These are countries, but the state has two distinct characteristics: territoriality and sovereignty. So in terms of a state, to be able to talk about a state, you mean territoriality and the governing sovereign organ. A state is also not a federal state like in the United States. It's not a territory, not a territorial federal in terms of federality. Three, the state is also not a government. And many people, when they talk about country, federal states, and governments, they confuse the word state with these. So we're very technical in our definition. It must have these two unique characteristics. So when you talk about the United States having a weak state, what a political scientist means is that the power is dispersed, it's diffused, it has checks and balances. The United States is a very powerful state, it's a superpower, but it is a weak state in the sense that power is distributed. Yes, all of these included. Singapore is a strong state because power is centralized, it's not decentralized. So because power is focused, is centralized, we call it a kind of weak state. So Joseph Nye says context is key. So it depends on the context when you're talking about nation, state, sovereignty, territoriality, etc. So another word often used as a synonym for state is nation. This is unfortunate, he says, because the word nation is commonly used to denote a group of people. And when you talk about a group of people, they probably have a common language, a common culture, a common religion, a history, shared history, mythology, identity, sense of destiny. So they have shared very, very important values and norms with each other. So that's a group of people, meaning a nation. So national groups, for example, within the states, there could be many, many different national groups within one state. Often they could, it's also quite logical that national groups would claim a right to self-government or self-determination. Self-determination is what we mean by self-determination, is the ability to decide about your own political fate. So politically, you would want to distribute power, distribute economy, distribute employment, housing, all these distribution of resources on your citizens. It would be self-government or the right to self-determination. This can be a cause for conflict, obviously, and whereas a state requires to have some sense of stability, some sense of harmony within its own boundaries, right? So there are 5 factors. Joseph Nye says there are 5 factors to be a state. One, meaning a state must be recognized as a state by other states. So if you want to be recognized as a state, other states must accept you as a state. In this sense, in this relationship, being a state is like becoming a member of a club, right? So existing members, there are existing members, states. I was going to say countries, but we should say states. So existing members, states must admit you, accept you as a state. So one, is there a government de facto, and does it have control over a certain territory? If yes, that's good. It will be considered as a state. 2, whether other states claim that specific territory. So if there is dispute, it's problematic. If there is no dispute, you can claim that territory, and if so, how strong? So if it's your territory, it will be okay, right? So if there are other claims, there's going to be conflict concerning that territory. There are many examples. There are many examples. So this is a second one. 3, what are the people seeking to establish a new state are historically oppressed? So is there been in the history of this national group conflict in terms of establishing a new state. So they want to establish a new state. Has there been wars, battles, etc., etc.? So this would be third. So there is a historical perspective, right? So the first one is government. The second one is territory, and the third one is history. Is there a history on that territory? 3, 4, whether those people consider their government legitimate. So you can claim that you want to establish a new state, but how about the people? Do people who are going to live in that state recognize that specific government or national group as being legitimate? So legitimacy is very important in terms for sovereignty. So if there is no legitimacy for sovereignty, it's not going to happen, right? There's not going to be a state. 5, whether recognizing the new state as a sovereign would affect their own claims and interests. So this means that if they have this sovereignty, whether this sovereignty is going to influence, decide the fate of their claims and interests. Are they going to be able to work on their claims and interests domestically as well as in terms of foreign policy, right? So it requires a lot of organization, it requires bureaucracy, it requires a lot of different layers of government. Let's get back to realism and liberalism. Both realists and liberals agree. They're both in agreement that states constructivists as well. So, except Marxism. Marxism does not include a state in a sense that maybe in the beginning, yes, but in the end, the communism believes in a classless system, in a classless existence where all individuals are equal to each other. So in a way, they govern themselves, right? So the people govern themselves. But for realists and liberals, they agree with each other that the state is an important actor. So failed states have the capacity, in principle, to control the flow of people, goods, and money. So at the minimum, bare level, a state should be able to control the flow of people, goods, and money across borders. So there's a border, there's boundaries of the state, and it should be able to control people passing through, goods and money passing over the borders. So no state controls this perfectly. So there is no state which controls this in a perfect sense. 100% security, no. But most states control it fairly effectively. So we need a bare minimum of fair effectiveness in controlling this. Even failed states do this in a way, try to do this, attempt to do this, and there is that demand. So 2 states normally are the only actors that wield significant army. So if it's a state, it can have an army. It would be legitimate for a state to have its own army. 3, only states have the power to tax. So it would be legitimate for a state to tax its citizens, corporations, and spend that money, distribute those resources for its citizens, for its infrastructure, for technology, for its advancement and public policies, right? 4, only states promulgate and enforce law. So the only actor who can enforce law, constitutional law, are states. And in that sense, states, for realists and liberals, are the ultimate actors. And beyond that, there is no any other actor that can call a state to account for whatever the state is doing. So in that sense, above that, in the international arena, beyond the state, it's anarchy. And what does anarchy mean? We will get back to that in a second. But it's anarchy not in the sense that's anarchism, but it's anarchy in terms of international relations. So also Joseph Nye talks about power. Power, he says, is the ability to achieve one's purposes or goals. I mean, the state. State For a state, it's important to achieve its purposes or goals. More specifically, it is the ability to affect others to get the outcomes one wants. Robert Dahl from the University of Yale defines power as the ability for a state to get other states to do what they otherwise would not do. So this is a very significant definition. It shows that a state has power. It uses all these resources quite effectively and efficiently, and it can use either soft power or hard power to get other states do the things that this state wants and maybe other states don't want to do. But when, let me see. We're just going to summarize a bit of these paragraphs. So it's the ability to influence others is usually associated with the possession of certain resources. So also Nye goes along with Organsky, you should remember. So political leaders commonly define power this way. These resources include population, territory, natural resources, economic size, military forces, political stability, among others. Moving on. So states will prefer not to show their real power. So in the international arena, we will see that especially with the Cold War, you would have a situation where the United States nor the Soviet Union would want to show, or during the Second World War, that Hitler didn't want to show its own true power, what he could do. So there's a lot of bluffing going on. So it's like a poker game, right? States will mostly be rational and look at the cost-benefit ratio before taking actions. Does it happen always? No. Sometimes, especially when power is dispersed, when there are many power mechanisms within a state, like a democracy, there will be many phases of people, institutions, mechanisms who would measure the cost-benefit ratio. Some people will look at this rationally. Does it happen always this way? In cases of maybe totalitarian states, authoritarian states, leaders can take risks, or they can make mistakes. Remember the Iraqi war during the 90s, when the United States was bombing Baghdad. There was this general talking to the media, and he was bluffing. He was saying there is nothing going on at the moment in Iraq, and there was dust coming down because of the bombing of the city. So taking big risks or mistakes can be fatal for states. So a state, it would be advisable to make a good situation analysis. In this sense, it can be just as important to set the agenda. So before taking risks or making mistakes, it would be better to set the agenda. So the Netherlands is a very small country, but it can set the agenda within the European Union. So it has that soft power and attract others in world politics as it is to force others to change in particular situations. These aspects of power is also called the soft power or attractive power. Soft power can rest on such resources as the appeal of one's ideas. So with ideas and argumentation, reasoning, you can convince other states to put certain points on the political agenda. So, setting the agenda can be a form of power, and this would especially happen within democratic countries or states. We will get back to this as well. So power, we can observe that soft power is more important in relations among the post-industrial societies, democracies, in the information age in which the democratic peace prevails. Hard power is often more important in industrializing and pre-industrial parts of the world. So think about realism. Realism is actually a school of thought and emphasizes hard power. So realism would be something for the Middle Eastern countries, maybe countries where totalitarian regimes or authoritarian regimes are in power. But within the democratic establishment, where trade is more important and countries are doing intensively trade and production levels are interdependent with each other, they would probably choose to try to convince each other rather than using hard power or military establishment. So a point made last week about classical realism and neo-realism. Neo-realists such as Kenneth Waltz tend to be materialists who pay little attention. Materialism means that they pay little attention to the role of ideas. And in their efforts to be parsimonious. Parsimony means that something simple can explain something complex. Simple explanation for a very complex situation. Like, realism says the state is the only actor. So that's parsimonious. Parsimonious means that that you're trying to explain something very complex with something simple. The easiest explanation, the simplest explanation is the best explanation for even complex situations. So that's parsimonious. So classical realists like Machiavelli and Morgenthau never actually neglected ideas, but in the neo-realist school of thought, they have left ideas and they're focused on the role of the state. And this has also primarily to do with the last 50, 60 years of the First World War, the Second World War, and especially the Cold War, when we had a bipolar balance of power. So states were constantly with each other in war and conflict, or try to deal with the problems by way of conflict and war. So, but there is always a place. There should always be a place for ideas and arguments and reasoning, and that's constructivism. We will talk about constructivism because it has a place. Let's put it that way, especially in the democratic establishment. So as I said a couple of minutes ago, the international system beyond states is anarchic. Anarchic means that there are no central higher authorities that have complete sovereignty in international terms and legitimacy. So the international arena for realists is self-help. So states always think of their own interest, Manfaat. So a state always thinks of its own, interest in the international arena. But constructivists say it should not only be self-help, but it should also be other help. Self-help versus other help. So the international arena is anarchic, means that there is no international binding law. There is no world government. For example, when a state comes into problem, they cannot call 911 and call a bigger state to help them, or a central government who can account the other state for it and punish it. So it doesn't exist. So the in the international arena, there are international institutions, there are agreements, there are bilateral agreements. There are institutions, the International Criminal Court, the United Nations, the NATO, but these are not like sovereign as a state is over its own domestic territory. So let's make that distinction. Anarchic just means no central authority, world authority, okay? So moving on to the next slide. I'm just taking a bit my time. I hope it's okay with you. Because I'm just going through it a bit with a bit more extensive summary. So realists say that states have little choice. For realists, states have no choice in defining their national interests, and they must define their national interests. They must think of themselves, self-help, and they must define this in terms of power, because otherwise they won't survive. You cannot be altruistic. Altruistic means you cannot think of the other. And realists say you have to think of yourself. It is egotistical, and you have to think of yourself to survive. And if you think of the other, there is a big chance that you're not going to survive in the international arena. So for liberals and constructivists, they argue that national interests are defined by much more than a state's position in the international system, and they have a richer account of how state preferences and national interests are formed. The definition of the national interest depends in large part on the type of domestic society and culture. So for liberals tend to listen to the public, and we know science teaches us that the people don't want wars. For example, think of Turkey. when Turkey went into Syria, there was a lot of unrest, right? So there was a migration, Gulf of migration, and people started to migrate into Turkey, and Turkey was involved in military actions beyond its own borders, and the same thing happens maybe. There was frictions with Greece, and there are frictions with Armenia, etc. So it kind of makes people exactly. Very good. So you studied these. That's very good. So I'm going to, then I'm going to move on. So for just to finish this point, so for liberals, they look at the domestic policies. I'm going to move on if you've studied these. So the question is it going to be about structure or is it going to be about process? So just to make that, because this could be an exam question, so there is a difference between structure and process. So structure, let's think of a metaphor, a poker game. The structure is about the distribution of power. Who has how many chips? Which country has more resources to spend on? So if I have 100 euros and you only have 5 euros, I can take more risks, right? And you would not take too much risk because you only have 5 euros. If I have 100 euros, I can take twice as much, maybe 3 times more risk than you do. So that's about structure. Structure is about the distribution of power. How is power distributed? So that's structure. So structure is more realistic for realism school of thought. Process is about rules. What rules are we going to agree with each other? So if I cheat in a game, what's going to be my punishment? So we have to agree upon those. So is it going to be structure or is it going to be process? For example, so when you have prisoner's dilemma, so you've studied prisoner's dilemma. Prisoner's dilemma, when you have two prisoners who don't communicate with each other, they will most probably defect, right? So they will probably cheat on each other. But what if we introduce new rules to the game? And this is realism on prisoner's dilemma. So realism say, well, the prisoner's dilemma, the game theory, the prisoners are not going to, they're going to cheat on each other. They will defect. They will choose for the best. They won't trust each other. But what if you introduce communication from a liberal or constructivist way of looking at this? If you introduce communication and prisoners can talk with each other, there's going to be confidence and more trust between the prisoners, and they might not defect, right? So it's better for countries, states to be in communication. And if they don't communicate with each other, it's going to be problematic. So what makes a system stable? It's the social fabric. You can read this on your own leisure time. I'm going to skip it a little bit. For example, technology can make a system stable. These are 2 points. And then I'm going to talk about a little bit about communism. For communism, war can be explained by the nature of the capitalist society, because capitalism is imperialistic, and it requires, capital society requires resources, and they will produce with those resources products and try to sell it domestically and internationally. And when they run out of resources, they will go out and look for more resources. And an imperialistic expansionist state, a capitalist state, from a perspective of communism, will always be in arms races to protect their own interests. And there's going to be therefore conflict and therefore revolutions and etc. So it will always collapse. This communistic prediction of Karl Marx didn't happen, and but there is one common element between communism and liberalism. They both use as a level of analysis economic and domestic structures. So both look at, they oppose each other in many ways, but they're similar in locating the causes of war in domestic politics and economic factors. Waltz has a level of analysis. Waltz talks about a level of analysis. He says, well, there is an individual level, and you can look at individuals, leaders, for example. You could look at how they make decisions. and even though you can look at them, we know exactly. So that would be this book, and this is a great book, Waltz, as a neorealist. So he talks about at the individual level, but individual level doesn't always explain complex situations, right? So, but we could, you can look at the individual level, the history, the traumas, the biography of the leader, political leader, psychology, ideas, ideologies, rational, emotional fears, desires, self-esteem, confidence, social approval, etc. All of these factors are important, especially in authoritarian, totalitarian countries, states, regimes. You can look at the leaders because the leader is somehow some type of sovereign, right? So, for example, in the Netherlands, the prime minister cannot take on its own too much risk. It will be checked. It will be checked by the parliament, and the parliament, the opposition, will wheel them down. It will criticize them. It will be in the media, and he will be very, very criticized when he doesn't make rational choices, and he will have faced the consequences. So, moving on, state level. Marxism and liberalism both put a great deal of emphasis on the state level of analysis. Both hold that states will act similarly in the international system if they are similar domestically. Marxists argue that the source of war is capitalism. So these are the minor differences, but we could also, according to Waltz, look at the state level. And then there is the systems level. The systems level, interesting explanations often involve an interplay. So there is an interdependence between two or more levels of analysis. A satisfying explanation of the outbreak of World War I might invoke a combination of three factors: rigid bipolarity, a structural feature of the international system; crisis unstable military plans and doctrines as a result of military cultures within states; and serious motivated errors of judgment by key leaders. So it usually is a combination of all these layers. And the problem with realism is that it's parsimonious. And what was parsimonious? It is something simple trying to explain something complex. Whereas when you look at the various levels, it usually is a complex. But in this sense, there should also be place for ideas, for argumentation, soft power, and other factors. So let me see. I'm going to move on a little bit. So this is new. This was the stuff for this week, dear Meltem, and we're going to do a Cold War analysis, and we're going to take a look at all the concepts in our toolkit, the definitions, and how the Cold War actually happened. So, given its violent first half, the First World War and the Second World War, the most remarkable feature of the second half of the 20th century was the absence of World War III. Instead of a World War III, there was a Cold War, a period of intense hostility without actual war. So fighting did occur, but not between the United States and Soviet Union, but it was on the periphery. So it was like in Vietnam, it was in Afghanistan, and if it was, Turkey was involved, the Greek civil war, Soviet Union, invading European, or actually freeing Eastern European countries and staying there. So it was actually on the peripheries. But what happened that caused the Cold War? And the Cold War, exactly, proxy wars. And the Cold War actually lasted almost 4 decades, 1947 till 1989. And during this period, Americans and Soviets had many contacts. So it was not it was not that there was no contact. There was a relationship. Think of the Second World War and Nazis, Hitler moving into Soviet Union, and Soviet Union actually working together with European countries like the United Kingdom and the United States to flush out the Nazis. So there were many contacts during the Cold War, and they tried to negotiate arms control and try to end the Cold War because none of the states wanted war, especially after the Second World War. We have two more concepts that we should take a look at: deterrence and containment. Deterrence and containment are probably maybe two possible answers for why the Cold War didn't turn hot. So the first question is, was it necessary to have a Cold War? I mean, was it avoidable? That's the first question. The second question is, why didn't both countries go into war? So deterrence is actually building a threat, a stock of arsenal of weapons. Every state builds a stock of arsenal weapons, in this case nuclear weapons, both countries, and the presence of the possibility that there could be a painful attack of retaliation is called deterrence. So deterrence is actually to threaten another state by the presence of your own weapons. So deterrence by nuclear threat was one way each superpower tried to prevent the other from gaining advantage and therefore upsetting the balance of power between them. So there was a balance of power. Both countries were nuclear, and they were looking for ways to tip the balance of power in the world, in the global sense, right? So that's deterrence. We knew during the Cold War that the United States had no desire for military conquest. So remember in the 1930s, US isolationism, so there was a domestic economic problem, so international trade wasn't really going well, and it caused an international or the financial crisis of the famous 1930. Which led actually the United States into isolationism, meaning that the United States wasn't really actually interested in becoming a superpower. So it didn't really have at that point military conquest, expansionist ideas, but it had one desire to keep its own citizens economically happy and increasing the living standards, increasing the standards of living in its own domestic society, because it's a democracy and people vote on politicians, so elections are important, right? So we remember that. But Americans had one assumption, and they believed that the Soviet Union had this expansionist drive. So they were assuming. So that's one mistake, right? So if they could not really get the feel of the Soviets, what their intention was. Now that the Soviet Cold War archives are open, this is Joseph Nye telling us. He says that it appears that the Soviet leaders were just as uncertain of American intentions as Americans were of theirs. So that's, you see, now we know that communication, international institutions are very, very important. So fearing Soviet expansionism, the United States practiced containment. And containment means keeping something harmful under control. So how do you control something dangerous, something harmful? This was a specific policy of surrounding the Soviet Union with US allies and US bases. So what was the United States trying to do? It was trying to build alliances. It was trying to build bases, military bases around the world to keep the Soviet Union controlled. The problem with that was, remember the Truman Doctrine? What says the Truman Doctrine? It says that the United States, together with the Truman presidency, they decided to invest in countries to become more democratized, who face authoritarian threat, other threats from outside. So it would invest in or help those countries, exactly Greece and Turkey, to become more democracies. So what was the United States doing with this? It was promoting its own liberal capitalist economic political world order. So that was the assumption of the Soviets, and they believed that the United States was not of goodwill or intention, since after the Second World War, the Potsdam Agreement, the unconditional surrender of Germany in the Second World War. Germany was divided into four areas, and so we will see in a minute how this Cold War started to escalate. So there are three approaches. The traditionalist approach. The traditionalists argue that the answer to the question of who started the Cold War is quite simple. So for traditionalists, it is Stalin and the Soviet Union. One explanation. It's quite parsimonious, right? At the end of the World War II, American diplomacy was defensive, while the Soviets were aggressive and expansive. The Americans only slowly awoke to the nature of the Soviet threat. So they're looking at the Soviet Union as the guilty part. What evidence do they have? The evidence traditionalists have is immediately after the World War, the Second World War, the United States was proposing a universal world order, the United Nations, right, for collective security through the United Nations. The Soviet Union did not take the United Nations very seriously because it wanted to expand and dominate its own sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Well, it was the Soviet Union that first freed the Eastern European countries, right? So the first soldiers that came into those Eastern European countries were the Soviet soldiers, and so for traditionalists, it's the Soviet Union trying to expand. It has expansionist ideals, and after the war, the United States demobilized. Even though the United States demobilized its troops, the Soviet Union left large armies in Eastern Europe. So this is one point. Soviet expansionism was further confirmed in the eyes of traditionalists when the Soviet Union was slow to remove its troops from northern Iran. So you should remember that during 1940-41, the Shah of Iran was actually neutral. He was saying that Iran was neutral. But the United Kingdom was blaming the Shah that he was working together with the Nazis, supporting the Nazis. So that was a big problem. And then there was another problem, that the Nazis cut off the Soviet transportation of goods and weapons from the United States. And they were looking actually at the transit corridor between Iran and Soviet Union. So they actually needed Iran. So that's why they actually got into Iran, and that's how Soviet Union Soviet troops actually got into northern Iran after the war, and they had to leave, Iran unwillingly. So United States actually pressurized Soviet Union to leave Iran. Even though Iran Shah said to the United States, when the first United Kingdom together with the Soviet Union invaded Iran, Shah expected help from the United States, but the United States didn't help. But when Soviet soldiers decided to stay in Iran, United States interfered through United Nations so that the Soviet troops would go leave Iran. So, but that didn't do any good to the Soviet and United States relations. So in 1948, the communists took over Czechoslovakian government. The Soviet Union blockaded Berlin in 1948 and 1949. After the World War II, Germany was divided into four areas. For France, United Kingdom, and United States and Soviet Union. Soviet Union got the eastern part of Germany, and that's how Berlin got divided by the wall. In 1950, Communist North Korea's armies invaded South Korea. According to the traditionalists, these events gradually awakened the United States to the threat of communist expansionism and launched the Cold War. Revisionists who wrote primarily between 60s and 70s believe the Cold War was caused by Americans rather than the Soviet expansionism. Their evidence is that at the end of the World War II, the world was not really bipolar. The Soviets were much weaker. The Soviets had lost 30 million people. The industrial production was weaker, and Soviets were not really interested actually in Eastern Europe or expansionists. They were interested in their own domestic stability and harmony, and they were actually primarily going to look into their domestic problems because they had lost millions and millions of people. So according to revisionists, it was actually the American capitalism, imperialism that triggered the Soviets to get into a defensive position. So revisionists come into two varieties that stress the first and the second levels of explanation. Level one, revisionists stress the importance of individuals and claim that Roosevelt's death and coming of Truman, Harry Truman, taking office, the policy from the United States became more harsher because Truman was playing its own citizens for elections, that the Soviet threat was bigger than it actually was. And Stalin, on his side, from his own point of view, saw that during the Second World War, communism didn't really work, so he's playing his own people with patriotism and nationalism, and he was making it bigger than it was as well. And then during the Potsdam Conference, Truman tried to intimidate Stalin by mentioning the atomic bomb, and Stalin was not impressed because he knew, because he had spies and he knew already that the United States had an atomic bomb, and after a couple of years, the Soviet Union had its own atomic bomb as well, nuclear weapons as well. So you see how these things started to escalate. There is the individual level. So Truman, doing cocky, and Stalin also being a totalitarian, authoritarian leader. They're opposing each other. They don't know much about each other, about their intentions, and then there are other developments as well. So let's move on. What happens is that the United States planned to make the world safer, but for Soviet Union, this creating the United Nations was a threat to its own safety, because the United Nations promotes liberal economic capitalist visions and ideals that the Soviet Union didn't really appreciate, and it perceived it as expansionist from that point of view, whereas the United States thought the Soviet Union has expansionist ideals. So for the Marshall Plan, helping Europe from the United States was perceived as expansion drift. The third one, and I'm going to leave it at that, post-revisionists say that they argue that the traditionalists and revisionists are both wrong, because nobody was to blame for the starting of the Cold War. It was inevitable. It was going to happen anyway. The reason for this is before the Second World War, before in 1939, there was a multipolar world, 7 major powers, and after the war there were only 2. So it was destined to happen. There were only 2 superpowers. Most of the other 5 had lost too much of their power, and so bipolarity was the result of the Second World War, and there was a power vacuum. So there was a power vacuum, and there was there was a lot of empty space to be filled in for both United States as well as the Soviet Union, and they were both sucked into this um, power vacuum. So how did it all start? Let me see. United States was being perceived as being naive, that they could convince the Soviet Union, because there was simply basically ideological big difference between the two states. So they're both different, very, very different from each other. And finding themselves in a power vacuum, bipolar, it was like, asking for problems, asking for trouble. Because Stalin was totalitarian, and he didn't value elections or democracy. He was just a totalitarian, authoritarian leader. So every time they met, a couple of things happened. The first time, there was a moment that Roosevelt and Stalin met in Tehran in 1943. And they talked about democracy. Stalin wasn't really interested, and there were Polish Americans that Roosevelt was interested in for his own elections. So he underestimated expectations of Roosevelt. Stalin underestimated, because what is elections? What is voting? I mean, why is it important? And then there's 1945 Yalta Agreement, where the Soviet Union created a puppet regime for, a government in Warsaw after the Soviet troops had driven out the Germans, and the Americans felt cheated. So, and as a reaction, in May 1945, remember I said that United States was was aiding the Soviet Union and European countries by Lend-Lease aid programs. So there was a financial line, resources, and weapons, and Americans decided to stop this program abruptly. And when that happened, the economic relationship was cut off. So it made the situation very, very suspicious. So this was interpreted as a hostile act. So, but what had happened was, during the war, there was a lot of financial problems. So the devastation that caused it was about approximately 20 billion, and that money was going to be paid. And Soviet Union demanded almost $10 billion. And this money, even though it was going to be paid back, the Soviets demanded this money from the United States, the France, and United Kingdom, who had occupied Germany. And Truman said, "Well, you have occupied part of Eastern Germany as well as Eastern European countries. So we will see how much will be left, and if any money is left, we can think of repaying you back." So this has caused for the Soviets to tighten control in the eastern zone of Germany. So another fourth issue was the Soviets were neutral in the Pacific War until the very last week. Then the Soviets declared war on and opportunistically seized from Japan outer Manchuria, southern Sakhalin Island, and the entire Kuril Island chain. At Potsdam, the Soviets asked for an occupation zone in Japan, like the American occupation zone in Germany, and the Americans didn't really want this to happen, which was another reason, a fourth reason for the Soviets to distrust the Americans. So, Meltem, we will continue next week. So this is going to be quite interesting. How the Cold War has started, has constructed itself, and the various levels of analysis.